My name is Claire Merritt. I'm 31 years old. 8 months ago, I stood in the banquet hall of a Marriott hotel in Columbus, Ohio, holding a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, listening to my father give a toast at his own retirement party. There were 63 people in that room: his colleagues, his golf friends, my mother's book club, family friends who had known me since I was 7 years old, my aunt and uncle who had driven 4 hours, my younger brother Danny and his wife, and standing 6 feet behind my father, slightly to his left, holding a glass of sparkling water and smiling politely, my publisher, Margaret Holt, who had flown in from New York that morning because she happened to be visiting her daughter in Columbus that weekend, and I had mentioned the party and she had asked if she could stop by. My father was mid-toast. He had been telling a story about how proud he was of his family. And then he turned to me. "Claire always had so much potential," he said, smiling at the room. "She was going to be a writer," she said. "Still says it, actually." He chuckled. "I keep telling her, 'You peaked in high school, sweetheart. That essay contest was your moment.'" A few people laughed. A few didn't. I watched Margaret's face go very, very still. But what my father didn't know was that 3 weeks before that party, my debut novel had been acquired by one of the top 10 publishing houses in the country for a deal worth $185,000. And the woman standing directly behind him, whose expression had just shifted from polite to something considerably more interesting, was the editor who had bought it. Before I tell you what happened next in that room, please like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this story. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love hearing from every one of you. Now let me take you back to where this really began. I grew up in a suburb of Columbus, in a house where achievement was celebrated loudly for my brother and quietly questioned for me. My family: Dad, Robert Merritt. 32 years in civil engineering. Methodical, certain, a man who believed that a career you could explain in one sentence to a stranger at a party was the only kind worth having. Mom, Susan. Warm, conflict avoidant, expert at smoothing things over with a laugh and a subject change. Danny, 3 years younger, mechanical engineering degree, now at a firm in Cleveland. My father's version of success, walking and talking. And me, the one who wanted to write. My father never said he was disappointed in me directly. He was too smart for that. He said it sideways, in the way people do when they've convinced themselves they're being helpful. When I was 12, I won a regional essay competition. 500 entries, first place, a small cash prize, and a certificate. I was so proud I could barely breathe. I showed my father at dinner. He read it, nodded once, and said, "It's good, Claire, but you can't build a life on adjectives." I told myself he just didn't understand yet. When I was 16, I was named editor of the school literary magazine. That same year, Danny made varsity soccer as a freshman. My father drove 4 hours round trip to Danny's away games. He came to my magazine launch, the one event we held all year, for 20 minutes, said he had to get back for a work call, and left before the reading started. I found out later there was no work call. I told myself he just didn't know how to show up for things that weren't sports. He'd learn. When I was 22 and graduating from Ohio State with an English degree and a thesis that my professor called the strongest undergraduate work she'd read in a decade, my father sat next to me at the graduation dinner and spent most of it asking Danny about his job prospects. When I mentioned I was applying for writing fellowships, my father looked at me over his water glass and said, "Claire, at some point the dream has to become a plan." I smiled. I said, "It is a plan." He didn't ask what the plan was. I told myself I would show him. Someday. I would show him and it would be enough. But there are only so many some days before you realize you've been working toward a moment that someone else controls, and you need to stop and start working toward something only you can give yourself. The breaking point didn't come with a shout. It came quietly, on a Tuesday evening in March, about 18 months before the party. I had been working on my novel for 4 years. Not dabbling, working. I had a part-time job at a nonprofit doing grant writing, 25 hours a week, specifically so that I would have time to write. I lived in a small apartment in Columbus. I kept my expenses at $1,900 a month. I had written 3 complete drafts. I had queried 41 literary agents. I had also, very carefully, not talked about any of this with my family. Not because I was ashamed, because I knew what my father would say, and I couldn't afford to let his voice into my head while I was still building something fragile and true. That Tuesday, I had just gotten my 14th rejection from a literary agent. It was a kind one, a real response, not a form letter, and the agent said my writing was beautiful, but she wasn't sure she could sell it in the current market. She wished me luck. I closed my laptop. I sat in my apartment. I ordered pad thai. I watched exactly one episode of a show I'd already seen 3 times, and then I opened the laptop again and started revising Chapter 7. But that same evening, my mother called. She'd been at my parents' house for a family dinner. Danny and his wife were there. She was calling to chat, she said, but underneath the chat I could hear something strained. "Your father mentioned you," she said eventually. "What did he say?" A pause. "He was telling Danny about a colleague whose daughter just made partner at her law firm, and he said..." Another pause. "He said he'd made peace with the fact that some of his kids were going to be the ones who peaked early." The room went a little quiet for me. "He said peaked early?" "I told him that wasn't fair," Mom said quickly. "I said Claire works hard. He said..." She stopped. "Mom, what did he say?" "He said, I know she does. I just don't think it's going anywhere." I sat with that for a long moment. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I mean that." After I hung up, I didn't cry. I didn't call him. I sat very still and I thought about the 14 rejection letters and the 4 years of work and the $1,900 monthly budget and the cold pad thai on my coffee table. I thought about being 12 years old with a first-place certificate and hearing, "You can't build a life on adjectives." Something settled in me. Not hardened, settled. Like furniture finally placed in the right room. I wasn't writing to show my father anything anymore. I was writing because I was a writer. Because I had always been a writer. Because the work was real whether he ever saw it or not. I opened a new document, started a new query letter. I sent it to Margaret Holt at Pembroke Press the following morning. I need to tell you about Margaret because she is essential to this story. Margaret Holt had been a senior editor at Pembroke Press for 19 years. She had a list of 12 authors, all literary fiction, 3 of them award-winning. She was known in publishing circles as someone who was difficult to get to and absolutely worth getting to. She responded to about 1 in 200 queries. She responded to mine in 11 days. "Dear Ms. Merritt," the email said, "I read your pages 3 times. I'd like to see the full manuscript. Please send at your earliest convenience." I read it standing in my kitchen. I read it again. I sat down on the floor. I sent the full manuscript that afternoon. 6 weeks later, Margaret called me directly. She had notes, detailed, surgical, brilliant notes that immediately showed me she understood exactly what I had been trying to do and could see both where I'd succeeded and where I hadn't yet. We talked for 2 hours. She told me the book had real commercial and literary potential. She told me she wanted to make an offer, pending revisions. "I want to ask you something," she said toward the end of the call. "Have you had much support for this work? From your community, your family?" I was quiet for a moment. "I've had support from friends," I said. "From my writing group. From some teachers who saw something early." "And family?" "My family," I said carefully, "is more comfortable with careers that fit in a box." Margaret was quiet. Then she said, "I see that in your writing, actually. There's a character in Chapter 4, the father. The way she keeps trying to translate herself into a language he can understand." A pause. "It's the truest thing in the book." I had to breathe for a second. "I know," I said. "Don't change it," she said. "It's why this book matters." Over the next 4 months, I revised. I cut 11,000 words and rewrote 30 pages and excavated 3 scenes I had originally been too careful to write honestly. I sent the manuscript back in February. Margaret came back with an offer in early March. It wasn't easy those 4 months. I was still working 25 hours a week at the nonprofit. I was still keeping my life at $1,900 a month, Rent $1,100, groceries $200, utilities, phone, the rest. I revised on evenings and weekends and occasionally on lunch breaks, a laptop open on a corner table at a sandwich place 2 blocks from my office. There were 2 nights I almost called Margaret and told her I couldn't do it. Not because the work was bad, but because revision at that level requires you to look directly at everything you got wrong. And there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being honest on the page when the rest of your life requires you to be careful. The second time I almost called, I made a cup of tea instead, opened the document, and wrote the scene I had been avoiding for 3 drafts. The scene where the daughter in the book stops explaining herself to her father and simply keeps walking. It took me 2 hours. When I finished, I read it back and thought, there, that's the true version. I sent it to Margaret the next morning. Her response came in 4 hours. This is the scene the whole book was waiting for. Don't touch it. I did not touch it. Meanwhile, my family continued on entirely as they had before. My father was deep in retirement planning. My mother was organizing the party. Danny called once to ask if I could help him draft a complaint letter to his HOA, which I did because it took me 15 minutes and he needed it. My mother asked me twice to help coordinate the party's catering, which I did. Neither of them asked about the book. My mother knew I was in revisions. She didn't ask how it was going, probably because she didn't have a frame for what that meant, and asking would have required her to explain to my father that I was working seriously on something, and that was a conversation she had learned not to start. I didn't bring it up. I had learned over many years that talking about the work before it was real was a way of giving people something to be skeptical about. I was done offering things up to be doubted. The offer came in on a Thursday. $185,000, a 2-book deal. Publication in 18 months. I sat in my car in a parking garage and called my best friend Jess, who screamed loud enough that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Then I sat in the car for another 30 minutes, just breathing. I called my mother. She cried with joy. She told my father. He said, "That's wonderful news." And the warmth in his voice was real. I want to be fair about that. It was real. But 3 weeks later, at his retirement party, with 63 people in the room and my publisher standing 6 feet behind him, he told the room I had peaked in high school. The Marriott banquet hall was exactly the kind of room my father had spent his whole career in. Beige walls, round tables, a small podium, a bar in the corner. His colleagues were mostly men in their 50s and 60s, the same salt and pepper and firm handshake energy as every engineering firm dinner I'd attended since I was a child. My father was in his element, happy, expansive, generous. He told 3 funny stories about projects he'd worked on, thanked his team by name, raised a glass to my mother for 34 years of patience. It was a genuinely good toast. Warm. And then he turned to Danny and me. He talked about Danny first. Danny, who had followed in his footsteps, who understood the value of a concrete goal and a clear set of deliverables. His voice was full. Then he turned to me. "Claire always had so much potential," he said. I felt Margaret shift slightly to my left. "She was going to be a writer," she said. "Still says it, actually." He smiled. "I keep telling her, you peaked in high school, sweetheart. That essay contest was your moment." A few laughs, some uncertain. Margaret did not laugh. I looked at her. She was looking at my father with an expression I can only describe as clinical interest. She caught my eye. She raised her eyebrows exactly once, a question. I gave her the smallest nod. And Margaret Holt set down her sparkling water, straightened her jacket, and walked directly up to my father. "Mr. Merritt," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Margaret Holt. I'm Claire's editor at Pembroke Press." My father shook her hand, pleasantly confused. "I couldn't help overhearing," Margaret said. "I wanted to introduce myself since I flew in from New York this weekend, and this party was too close to miss." She smiled. "Your daughter's book is one of the most exciting debuts I've signed in my 19 years in publishing." The room had gone a particular kind of quiet. "Her deal closed 3 weeks ago," Margaret continued. "A 2-book contract. The book publishes in 18 months. I expect it will do quite well. But more than the business of it," she paused just briefly, "it's a remarkable piece of work. She's been working on it for 4 years, and every year of that work is visible in the pages. It's the kind of book that gets written by someone who doesn't give up on the thing they know they're meant to do. She looked at my father pleasantly. You must be so proud of her. My father's mouth was open. It closed. It opened again. Yes, he said. Absolutely. I was watching his face. I've known that face for 31 years. There was the confusion of being caught. There was something else underneath it, softer and harder at the same time, something that looked like a man realizing he had just said something in public that could not be unsaid, and that the room had heard it, and that the stranger now standing in front of him had heard it and had not let it pass. My aunt, who was standing 3 feet away, said quietly, "Oh, Claire." One of my father's colleagues, a man named Howard who had known our family for 20 years, put his hand on my father's shoulder and said, "Bob, a publisher flew in for your daughter, that's something." Mitch, my father's closest friend from work, said, "I didn't know about the book deal, Claire. That's incredible." My father turned to me. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he had not seen coming. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. Margaret had said what needed saying, and she had said it better than I ever would have in that moment, because she had said it without anger, without performance, without a single word that was unkind. Just facts, quietly detonated. I looked at my father and I said, "Congratulations on your retirement, Dad. I mean that." And I walked to the bar and got a glass of water, and Jess, who had come as my guest and witnessed the whole thing from 15 feet away, appeared at my elbow and pressed her shoulder against mine and said under her breath, "I need you to know I will talk about this moment for the rest of my life." The drive home that night was quiet. I took the long way. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt something more like tired and whole at the same time. A kind of ache that comes not from being hurt, but from a long tension finally releasing. My father called me the next morning at 9. "Claire," he said. His voice was different, careful. "I want to talk about last night." "Okay." "What I said. In the toast." A pause. "I've been turning it over since I woke up." "I know. I didn't mean it the way it came out." I thought about that. About what it meant, whether it was true, whether it mattered, whether the way something comes out and the way it was meant are as different as we like to believe when we're the ones who said it. "Dad," I said, "I think you meant some version of it. I think you've believed some version of it for a long time. And I think you said it in a room full of people who know me because you didn't think it would land anywhere. You thought it was just a joke about my daughter, the dreamer." A pause. "It wasn't." Silence. "You're right," he said. That surprised me. He stopped, started again. "I've been measuring your choices by a ruler that was built for my life, and I've done it for a long time. And I've told myself it was concern, but last night I heard myself say those words out loud in a room full of people, and I heard what they actually were." His voice was rough. "I'm sorry, Claire. I'm genuinely sorry." I sat with that. I have my father's stubbornness. I know how much it costs him to say those words. "Thank you," I said. "I mean it." We talked for 40 minutes. Not everything was resolved, it never is in one call. But something real moved. 8 months later, my life looks like this. The book is in final copy edits. The publication date is set for next spring. Margaret and I speak every 2 weeks. There's early interest from 2 film production companies. Nothing definitive yet, but the conversation is happening. My father has read the manuscript. All of it. He called me after he finished and was quiet for a long moment before he said, "The father in this book." Another pause. I recognized him. "I know," I said. "He loves her," my father said, "even when he doesn't know how to show it." "I know that too," I said. "That was always the point." We're different now, my father and I. Not repaired, revised. He asks about my work. Not always the right questions, but he asks. He came to a reading I did last month at a local bookstore. A small event, 20 people, nothing glamorous. He sat in the 3rd row and held the program in both hands and stayed for the whole thing. he didn't leave early. Margaret, for her part, has become something between a colleague and a mentor, and also occasionally the person I tell impossible stories to over the phone, while she laughs and says, "Claire, you have to put this in the next book." I probably will. If you've spent years trying to translate yourself into a language someone else could understand, a parent, a partner, a family that measures value in salaries and certainties, I want to say something to you directly. You do not need their vocabulary to be fluent in your own life. The work is real whether they see it or not. The dream is real whether they respect it or not. And sometimes the most powerful moment isn't when you stand up and argue your worth. It's when you've been so quietly, relentlessly building something true that the truth finally walks into the room on its own and says what you never had to. You don't need anyone's permission to peek. You just need to keep going. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. If this story meant something to you, please like and subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you know. I have a question for you in the comments. Has someone ever underestimated you out loud, in front of other people? What happened? How did you carry that, and what did it teach you? Drop your answer below. I read every single one. Until next time, keep building the thing only you can build. Somebody's watching, and it might be exactly the right person.